which is doing well, as far as I'm concerned. Okay, now, the next chapter is something that I must say people in society in general do not think about enough, of course, any time in history, but especially in our day and age. This is, I believe, we may have moved even further past it, but I believe this is the age of it's all about me. And I think there's probably not a person here who hasn't noticed that. Your average person is in everything for what they can get out of it. They believe they're entitled, and that false notion is just perpetuated by the media and universities, schools, whatever. How many times do you hear on the radio or if you watch TV, get this vacation or get the vacation you're entitled to, or get what you deserve. You earned this, get it. Well, in a very real way, in the end we will earn heaven or hell, but in this life we can't say that we deserve anything in particular except what God sends our way for the most part. But the opposite is what I'm actually talking about tonight, and what the coming chapter deals with, is that we shouldn't think about what we have coming to us so much as what we owe to God and to others. You just never hear that. I owe God, I was trying to tell this to somebody once, and I said, well, by the very fact that we're created by God, we owe him things. And they said, well, I didn't ask to be created. It's not looking too good for that person, I would say. Because whether you asked to be created or not, and it's difficult to ask to be created since you're not around to ask before you're created, by the very fact that we are created by God, who is God, with all the qualities we talked about in the first class, it stands to reason that we owe him something. Look at you out there who have children, even you think in human terms, even though you only helped in the creation of your children, you can't help but think that they owe you something for everything you do for them, right? You feed them, clothe them, give them an education and all this kind of stuff. And at least I should hope that what's in the back of your mind is that if your parents did that for you, you owe them. And if you did that for your kids, they owe you something. And in fact, those somethings they're parallel to and reminiscent of, but only a vague shadow of, what we actually owe to our Creator. A lot of what you owe your parents or your kids owe you, in a sense, will be determined by how good the parent was. If a parent was abusive and all that kind of stuff, well, I'd say the most a child owes an abusive parent is to get as far away as possible, and pray for them. You always must pray for your parents. But as I like to say, sometimes the fourth commandment is best observed from a distance, because there are parents who just shouldn't have been parents, but were, and the kids suffer because of it. All right, so that sets the tone. Just think about it. We are created by God, who is God. So we owe him, namely, everything, but these fall into 4 categories, mainly. Okay, so it starts out with, we must love God. Man's highest activity is love, and there is no nobler object of his love than God. So the first and greatest commandment is, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with thy whole heart, and with thy whole soul, and with thy whole mind. Nothing is more important than that. Would that I had as many hearts as there are grains of sand in the depths of the seas to love thee with, O God. Love alone maketh heavy burdens light, and beareth in light balance things pleasant and unpleasant. It beareth a heavy burden, and feeleth it not, and maketh bitter things to be savory and sweet. Nothing is sweeter than love, nothing higher, nothing stronger, nothing larger, nothing more joyful, nothing fuller, nor anything better in heaven or in earth. For love descendeth from God, and may not rest finally in anything lower than God. And that's by Thomas à Kempis, who wrote The Imitation of Christ. So many men today expect God to tolerate from them contempt, insubordination, disobedience, and neglect, such as they would never tolerate from their own children. In Scripture, God asks, "If then I be a father, where is my honor? And if I be a master, where is my fear?" Failure to love God can only result in tragedy for the individual, either in this world or in the next. Now, a couple things to keep in mind on that note. The ability to love God comes from God, and it's something we must pray for. It's not like you start out the day and say, I'm really going to increase my love of God today. I mean, you can pray that that's the case, and you can make acts of love. But the actual capacity for loving God comes from Him and is given to us in our souls, and we reciprocate by using it. A word of warning to parents and to those who will be parents or would be parents. You can help or hinder a child's ability to love God by the way you treat your child. To a child, Daddy is God the Father and Mommy is the Blessed Virgin Mary, as far as that goes. Somebody who is an abusive father, for example, has a much heavier price to pay because he is teaching his children that father is this mean, tyrannical, hurtful person. And they will grow up equating that with God the Father. And consequently, their very entry into heaven can be hindered by the way their earthly father was. So those who are fathers, those who are going to be fathers or mothers for that reason, remember that you must in every way for your children mirror God or the Blessed Virgin Mary, which means you have to act accordingly. You have to act with charity, kindness, love, generosity, all the good qualities, and that you want your child to learn about their heavenly Father and Mother, and that's a very great responsibility. There's no place for deviating from the Christian path when there are children involved, because they will do whatever it is they see you doing, and they will repeat the things they hear you saying. And God help you if that isn't perfectly Christian and charitable, and you lead your child away from heaven rather than towards heaven. Okay, so that being said, we move on to where it says God's claims. Now, okay. It's not as if God had to say, by the way, all of you down here, here's what I want out of you. Okay? Yes, He's done that. We have the Ten Commandments, we have the teachings of Jesus that perfect the Old Testament understanding of what it is that we're supposed to do on this earth, and give it a dimension that it did not have until God became incarnate. But merely by the fact that He made us, you can deduce of most of the things that we owe to God. It doesn't have to be told to you. You can know by the nature of being a creature created by the Creator. You see what I'm saying? Okay? If somebody creates you, you owe them stuff, and they don't really have to tell you what that is. Think about if you could create, and you created a little creature, and what you would figure that creature would owe you, especially if you made the mistake of giving it free will, right? You would expect certain things out of it. And that's why it's much better that God is God and we're not God. Because, if we made little Play-Doh creatures come to life, and then they rebelled against us and tried to nail us to a cross in reward for that, we'd probably just go splat, remember things from, that thou art Play-Doh, and I do Play-Doh, thou shalt return. Okay, but we're not, and it's absolutely amazing that, to me sometimes, that God doesn't do that with us, considering the nature of our rebellion. All right, so God's claims. Can't I do what I like with my own life? What a frequent objection this is, yet how silly. At a beach sand building competition, a boy and a girl had finished a magnificent castle. And when they wandered around to look at the efforts of the other children, returning, they found that another boy had occupied their castle. Okay, so in essence, the kid tries to claim it, and they just said, we made it, and the intruder gets turned out, and the kids win the prize. Well, that's obvious enough. Let's skip up to page 7. All right, what we owe to God can be summed up in these 4 things, which you can word different ways in order to remember them. As it turns out, these are the same 4 things that form the 4 objects of a perfect prayer. Okay? You can pray for different things at any one, in any one time. You can have a pain in your leg and decide to pray to God to take it away. Or you can pray for a better job. You can pray to thank God for getting the better job or whatever. There are different things you can pray for at any one time. What is that?
That's the school's phone.
Oh, okay. Sandy, where are you? Get the phone. A perfect prayer, though, has contained within it, well, it's not that a prayer to get a better job isn't perfect in itself, but an all-around perfect prayer will have these 4 different things contained within it as well that are called the 4 ends of prayer. But in this book, we're introduced to them as our 4 obligations towards God merely for having created us. Okay? We owe him adoration because he is goodness itself, and we owe him our homage and love. See, no question of him being a bad father that we have to decide how we're going to treat him. God is the perfect Father, and there's only one, and he is love. There is only one way to treat him, and that is with our absolute, first of all, obedience, which is first starting with that adoration. Next, contrition. When we have sinned, and we have not been good to God and must tell him we're sorry. Thanksgiving for all he has done for us and will continue to do for us, and we owe him our profound thanks. And supplication because we are totally dependent on his graces, or to be or to do good. We need to pray to him for these graces and aids. Now, they use the acronym ACTS, Adoration, Contrition, Thanksgiving, and Supplication. Other texts, which I learned that a long time ago, use parts. Petition, adoration, reparation, and thanksgiving. So any way you want to do it, acts or parts, you can switch it around, and as long as you remember to do the 4 things, I guess it doesn't matter how you remember them. So, our duty then, we have to adore, we have to be sorry for our sins, thanksgiving, supplication. but also in general absolute obedience. We owe God absolute obedience to his will, and we can never claim any right to the contrary. There is no such thing. In fact, you can never claim a right to do anything which is contrary to the will of God, because only God has rights by his own nature. We have what they call contingent rights that he gives to us. So things that people call rights very often are not. Like in law, we have a woman can have a right to an abortion, a right to kill her child. That isn't a real right. It doesn't exist before God and cannot be recognized, because it is contrary to the law of God, for example. Okay. Thou hast made us for thyself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. God wants our loving service. He has made us free in order to love him or to reject him. Now, free meaning physically free. We have free will. We are free physically to reject God. We are not free morally to do it. We have no moral freedom to reject our Creator and not be obedient and give him what we owe him for having been created. He does not want the service of a human machine. We are able to resist his rights, but of course it is wrong for us to do so. Another name for resistance to God is sin. It may appear to give temporary happiness, but in the end, sin is what takes us from our Maker, and it can bring us only sorrow. We must dedicate to God all our being, our intelligence by striving to know him more and more, especially through prayer, and our will by daily increasing in love for him, which is proved by our obedience to his commandments and other manifestations of his will. Saint Jean Vianney, the curé of Ars, was walking through the fields one spring day with a friend. The trees were full of birds and the air was full of their singing. The curé stopped to listen. "Ah, little birds," he said, "you were created to sing, and you are singing. Man was created to love God, and he does not love him." So an interesting thing then. All of creation, except mankind, has no other option but to be completely obedient to God. The birds, whatever they do, is in obedience to God because they have no choice. A bee, even a bee who stings you, is being obedient to God because that's what he made it to do. Man is the only one who can be disobedient to God. So, we have page 8 here. What is man? Y'all see that? Why did God make you? God made me to know him, to love him, and to serve him in this world, and to be happy with him forever in the next. Remember, we talked about that's why he made us. That's not necessarily what we're going to end up doing, because we can mess that up. Making us to do that doesn't guarantee the outcome because of free will. To whose image and likeness did God make you? To his own image and likeness. Is this likeness to God in your body and in your soul? Chiefly in my soul. And how is your soul like to God? Because it is a spirit and immortal. What do you mean when you say your soul is immortal? I mean that my soul can never die. See, that's the fact of it, for better or for ill. When our soul is created by God and infused into us at the moment of our conception, that soul will never perish. The souls in hell wish that their soul would be annihilated, but it never will be. It will continue for all eternity, just as the souls of the blessed will continue for all eternity. So once a soul is made, it's around forever and ever. So of which must you take most care, your body or your soul? I must take most care of my soul, for Christ has said, what doth it profit a man if he gain the whole world, and suffer the loss of his own soul. In fact, even St. Paul makes this point about the runners, remember? And he says, all these athletes, they all, discipline their bodies and this kind of thing. And that's to gain a corruptible crown, where we need to be looking for the incorruptible crown. How many people do you see a lot of people going to the gym, right? They have 24-hour fitness and things like that. By comparison, how many of them make visits to a church or pray the rosary on a daily basis? So we have, especially in our day and age, this overemphasis on the physical fitness of people, and at the same time, total disregard for their spiritual fitness. And as you can see by this particular question here, in the end, God isn't going to ask you, how big were your biceps, right? He's going to look at your soul. How much grace did you give? How much did you love him and your fellow man? How did you follow the commandments? And this kind of thing. So, everything must be put in its proper place. Is there any likeness of the Blessed Trinity in our soul? There is this likeness of the Blessed Trinity in my soul, that is, in one God there are three persons, so in my one soul there are three powers. And these are my memory, my understanding, and my will. All right. Now remember, the way we run things is if you have any questions or comments, or you can just give it a shout there, okay? Man is a creature of God. He has a body and a soul, the latter made to God's image and likeness, in that it is a spirit. He is immortal and is endowed with intelligence and free will. So now, okay, different books, I kind of have to warn you, because when you read spiritual books a lot, you'll notice that they sometimes use words even in English slightly different. And I just want to alert you to it. I'm not even saying this is wrong or the other one's wrong. I'm just saying you have to decide in your head how you're going to use these words and what they mean when you're talking to people, and then you have to agree on it. Now, okay, so he says here, soul is not just another word for spirit. Animals have souls, but their souls are not spirits. Only man's soul is a spirit. In man is the only kind of soul that is also a spirit. Well, I don't know where he gets this terminology, because we've always learned that animals have souls as well as men, and they're obviously spirits, since you can't see a hamster's soul leave its body once it dies or anything like that. The difference is that the hamster soul actually doesn't leave its body when it dies. It's a mortal soul. Only man has an immortal soul. So whether you want to use soul and spirit, or just immortal soul and mortal soul, you'll see it differently in different books. But in general, I think mortal soul and immortal soul is probably a better way to look at it, because soul is what gives life. What is the difference between somebody that was alive one minute and dead the next? They're not breathing, their heart isn't going, they weigh the same, pretty much. Why is this one body breathing and, heart is beating and whatnot, and it's warm to the touch, versus this other one that isn't? What's missing from the dead person? It's the soul. The soul has separated from the body, okay? Which I know is obvious enough. In the beginning, when God created us before the sin of Adam, our souls were so tightly joined to our bodies that it was impossible to separate the two. You could be injured, but the soul had such a grip on the body that you were immortal before that, which is what immortality is. If you got injured, that would cure no matter pretty much what the injury was or whatever. If Adam hadn't sinned, we'd still be that way. But when Adam sinned and brought sin into the world, this grip that the soul had on the body became far more weak. And that's why we can die. It's as simple as that. Right?
Monsignor, so the only way, I have a hard time understanding the soul of an animal. Is the only reason we know they have souls is because that gives them life, and if they
Yes.
they die, their
That's
soul's
it.
gone?
If something is alive, it has a soul. It has, either a mortal or immortal soul.
It doesn't go to heaven or hell, or it just is gone.
It dies when they do.
So to tell your children that their goldfish went to goldfish heaven is just like Santa Claus. It doesn't exist. I mean, that's just a bunch of food.
It may work for a while. Goldfish has gone to goldfish heaven. And, you don't want to ruin the kid, right? Tell them later on there is no goldfish.
Well, isn't it better to tell them something that makes more sense as opposed to tell them that they went to goldfish heaven?
Well, I don't know. Depends on the kid. Whatever works, right?
Now you start not telling the truth, and when do you start telling them?
Well, fine. If you want to, drop that on a kid.
Well, I mean, not just lay it out there where they can't understand. No.
I just tell them that there's no Santa Claus, right?
Well, I don't perpetuate that, so I guess.
Monsignor, when you were talking about Adam's soul, in the book, The Four Last Things, it says that it's painful when our soul separates from our body at death.
Well, yeah, because it's meant, our bodies and souls are meant to be together. And so there is that pain of separation. Now, mind you, if the person's totally unconscious, you don't know how much their body feels, but certainly their soul will feel the separation. I don't know if that's universally the case. Like the Blessed Virgin Mary did not have to undergo death because she was conceived without original sin, but she chose to. So probably her separation of body and soul might not have been painful. I don't know. I think our Lord might have spared her that. But otherwise, yeah. Okay, so soul is defined as the principle of life in a living body. Angels, therefore, are not souls. They do not animate a body, but animals have souls, which, however, are material and not immortal. The human soul is defined as the ultimate internal principle which animates our bodies and by which we feel, think, and will. A human person is a union of soul and body. Although the human soul is a spiritual substance capable of existing by itself, as we know from Revelation that it does so exist between physical death and resurrection of the body. It has a natural aptitude and even need to exist in a body. In this life, the body cannot perform a single action independent of the soul, nor can the soul do anything independently of the body. Souls are not inherited. Each is a distinct creation of God and is united with the body at the moment of conception. It's important to note as we go into this chapter, where it says there, the human soul is defined as the ultimate internal principle which animates our bodies, and by which we feel, think, and will. Okay, so feeling, emotion, thinking, which is, the thinking process, the process of reason, and will, which is what the faculty we use to decide what to do. Okay, those reside in the soul, not in the body. Your brain is somewhat of an antenna, I suppose. It's an organ that connects the faculties of the soul with the body in a particular way. But it is not your brain that technically where the process of reason resides. It's actually in your soul. That's kind of an important principle there. And souls are not inherited, obviously. Man has a spiritual soul. There is an obvious difference between a living human body and a corpse. That difference is the soul. It is the soul which prevents a living body from doing the only thing a corpse can do, return to dust. There must be a principle of operation behind every activity. In man, there must be a principle which thinks and wills. That principle cannot be a mere chemical, otherwise doctors and scientists would be able to discover it. Yet it is something, a spiritual soul which is beyond the reach of chemical analysis. A material principle could not have spiritual operations. Man's soul has spiritual operations, therefore it cannot be only material. This is largely philosophy. If you find it a bit difficult and or dry, just try to understand it and bear with it, because a lot of what we do with regard to the faith and theology are philosophical principles that, we quickly plow through them, but they mean something very important. So when we say that, like these things about man's soul having spiritual operations, therefore it cannot be material, believe it or not, this wasn't worked out by St. Thomas Aquinas. This was worked out by the ancient Greek philosophers. The ancient Greek philosophers were almost, you might say, in their philosophy, they were almost Catholic in a sense. I mean, not in the sense that they knew Christ, but as far as what they had derived about the basis of theology from their philosophizing and things like that. They set the foundation for Catholic theology, explaining these kinds of things. So that's why they're important. You can see in salvation history, let's call it, why God caused the Greek philosophers to flourish when they did. We have this kind of a notion of the Greek philosophers and their empire, the Greek empire. It was a flash in the pan. And these philosophers that we all esteem very, very great, Aristotle and Plato, their own people didn't read them for the most part. They didn't, Aristotle was put to death, or Socrates was put to death for adhering to the teachings of Plato and teaching them, corrupting the youth. So they were not appreciated in their own time. But come the Roman Empire, which set the stage for Christianity, right? Curiously enough, the language of the Roman Empire was Latin. The culture of the Roman Empire was Greek. And they took with them, all over where they went, this philosophy of the Greeks, of the great Greek philosophers. Why is that important, and why did God intend that? Because there are things in Catholic theology that we would never be able to put in really good language were it not for the Greek philosophers. They worked out many of the things that form the basis of Catholic thought later on. For example, transubstantiation. I'm jumping further on in the book, I know, but you all know pretty much what I'm talking about. The notion that when a priest, let's take Jesus. When Jesus at the Last Supper took the bread and said, "This is my body," because he is God, we know that became his body. Now, it didn't look like his body, it continued to look like bread. But when God takes a piece of bread and says, "This is my body," you can count on it that it's his body. It was only with Greek philosophy that we could give that words in theology. And namely, Greek philosophers, they distinguished between substance something that made something truly what it was, and accidents, which is what made something look, appear, smell, taste like something. And the notion that the two are separate principles gave us the way to talk about the substance, what made it what it was, being changed into another substance while retaining the accidents, the appearance. So just, I know this is the advanced stuff coming later, but it just shows you how this Greek philosophy became at the service of Christianity and how important it was. Also, okay. All day long we make statements which show that we have abstract or universal concepts. For example, the dog is a noble animal. Edith. She likes this one. Making such a statement, we do not think of a particular dog of definite shape, color, size, or breed, but we have taken, so to speak, the essence dog and are thinking of a thing we cannot contact with our senses. The idea in our minds is a spiritual one. So reverse it if you want to see it maybe a little bit easier. I can take any dog known to mankind, and they are many and marvelous, okay? We have everything from like a little teacup, like Chihuahua, or a little gizmo kind of dog that's probably about, it's the size of a rat, sounds like a rat, but it's actually a dog, okay? All the way up to an English Mastiff, or an Irish Deerhound, or Scottish Deerhound, which are like as big as cows, okay? And they have all different, faces, and how all, like bulldogs, all wrinkled up faces, some are long snouts, whatever. But I can take any one of those and I can say to you, what is this? And you'll say, that's a dog. They look as totally different almost as anything could look, from a Chihuahua to a Scottish Deerhound, or a Mastiff, or a Chow Chow, or whatever it was, or a Chow. Chow Hound? Chow Chow. Chow Chow, yeah. Chow Hound is something else. But you have this concept which, when you see a dog, it fits the abstraction in your mind that says it's a dog, right? And this abstraction is in the spiritual realm. Similar to this is our anticipation of the future, the consideration of possibilities, the logical deduction of conclusions from premises, the notion of spiritual being, and so on. John thinks. He can reflect on his thinking. He can apprehend himself, who is reflecting, to be identical with the being who thinks. There is complete and perfect reflection of an agent back upon itself, a process quite impossible to matter. For example, a piano cannot play itself, an eye cannot see itself, and a scythe cannot cut itself. A mouse cannot reflect on anything but peanut butter and cheese, for that matter. And it doesn't really reflect, it just goes after it and it eats it. So man is the only one who's capable of abstracting and reflecting, and that's because of the nature of the spiritual faculties that reside in his soul. Now then, as I have said, gave away the plot, didn't I? The soul is immortal. Therefore, man's soul is spiritual. It is not made up of parts that are distinct and separable. Even though the body dies, the soul cannot undergo corruption in itself or be killed through the agency of any creature. The only way it could cease to exist would be by annihilation by God, and that would be against his infinite wisdom, goodness, and justice. In other words, it's against his providence to annihilate a soul. Again, all men desire perfect happiness. If that desire could only end in frustration, human nature would not have been created defective by God, or would have been created defective by God, and that it is unable to fulfill the end for which it was created by him, namely for happiness. In other words, we're always seeking happiness in one way or another, right? We want to be more comfortable. We want better things for ourselves, for our children. We want stability. There's this set of things that we all desire that we believe will make us happy, right? At least in this life. Well, the ultimate, we desire ultimate happiness. We want, in this life we might say, well, if I get a better job, I will be happier. But where does that happiness go to? I may be happier, but what's the ultimate happy that's based on? Which would be heaven. The ultimate happy is heaven. And the word happy, as I told you before, doesn't mean whoopee, party hat, noise maker. That's not happy. Happy means blessed. So the ultimate blessedness, happiness, thing which we seek for, can only be found in heaven. It would be inconsistent with the God that we know, because it would be a cruel trick if he created us for ultimate happiness and there were no ultimate happiness. There has to be by his nature, okay? So that ultimate happiness that either explicitly or implicitly we all look for must exist because of the nature of God, because he could not deceive his creatures. See, and we're the only ones who think about that kind of thing. Dogs, however noble they may be, do not think about eternal life. They think about a nice little place to lie down. They think about, their food and whatever. But they don't sit there and meditate on ultimate happiness. Or you think they do. And the things of heaven. Okay, so there was this movie, All Dogs Go to Heaven. You remember that a long time ago? Theologically a little bit messed up. But been giving us trouble ever since. All right. So all men desire perfect happiness. If that desire could only end in frustration, human nature would have been created defective by God, in that it is unable to fulfill the end for which it was created, namely for happiness. His wisdom and justice demand that a desire springing from human nature itself must be capable of attainment. In other words, perfect happiness is the destiny God has appointed for man. It must therefore be attainable by all who act in conformity with the divine will. But perfect happiness cannot be attained in this world, and therefore there must be a future life in which it is to be found. So, we're made for this happiness. We all seek after this perfect happiness, but the real perfect happiness can't be here. Therefore, there's someplace else that it does exist, or else God is just treating us cruelly and causing us to hope for something that doesn't exist. And he can't do that by his very nature. Another proof that the soul is immortal is to be found in the conviction that God's justice demands a future life in which the obvious inequalities of this life will be redressed. Conscience implies the existence of a supreme legislator lawgiver, who will recompense, that is pay back, the good and punish the wicked. Yet during this life, the wicked only too often prosper, while the good suffer. To suggest that death is the end of everything is an affront to the infinite justice of God. And I did talk about that last time. Obviously, we see many, many good people suffering and many, many wicked people prospering. The justice of God demands an afterlife for those that do not redress that in this life, that don't get their comeuppance, for example, in this life. There has to be an afterlife, or God is not just, which he is. Therefore, There is a place where the good are rewarded and the bad are punished after this life is over, demanded by God's justice. Huh?
So I have one of my friends I was talking to about, suffering and, how we view suffering as a good thing. Well, she's Norm, so sometimes I think we're on the same page, but then I'll say something and she came back and say, well, she doesn't think that suffering, that God, that's not just God to have them suffer. I didn't know
That is
how to
not, what do you mean?
respond.
What do you mean? It's not just about being what?
To suffer. God doesn't want us to suffer. He wants us to be happy here on earth. And I mean, of course, I know that that's not true because I just believe it,
Mhm.
But I didn't know what to say to her.
Well, in a sense, I would explain it by, there's no way to do an end run around the will of God, okay? If anything happens in this life, we have to remember that God is our all-good, all-powerful Father, right? All good being the more important thing in this conversation. That He is love. He is our loving Father. Whatever happens in this world has to be His will in one way, shape, or form, because there's no way to do an end run around it. Are we going to say there's things that happen in this life that aren't the will of God, that He doesn't either cause or permit to happen? And because, yes, He does not, in a sense, will the suffering for its own sake. He directs the suffering that entered the world by the sin of Adam to the greater good of the person or people involved and to His glory. See what I mean?
Yeah.
Because you can't, there's only, God either permits something or He causes it directly. There's no other option. There aren't things that fall outside of those options. So if we suffer, then we know that it is either being caused or allowed, sent to us or allowed to happen to us by our all-loving Father. There's no other way to do
So
it.
because it's His will,
It's His will, and it depends what we do with it. You know what I mean? You can do a lot of things with suffering. You can, first and foremost, best thing to do with it is accept it as God's will for you and offer it up for your own, in payment for your own sins, in reparation for the many sins of mankind against God and blasphemies against Him and His Blessed Mother, to convert us. Suffering can make us holier if we offer it up and try to understand it in the light of God. Or you can curse God for sending the suffering, which would totally turn the suffering into a diabolical thing instead of a spiritual good. Because if somebody used that suffering merely to curse God for it, then he's sinning. And God, as much as He would want that person to use that suffering for a good end, won't force him to do it. Okay? So you have a notion now?
Yes. Thank you.
But if you're going to explain if you're having a conversation with somebody, wouldn't they pretty much have to be think like you in order for them to understand that concept?
Well,
Yeah.
you'd have to get them to think like you.
Right, okay, and so just one conversation about that.
Take like one of the things I said. Now let's take somebody who may or may not think like you exactly, but if they think, if they think at all and they believe in God, then you can say, okay, everything that happens is the will of God, and for these reasons. Because either He willed it directly or He let it happen. He allows it for that person. And in either case, it's His will. And they go, well, no, I don't think so. You go, well, what's the third option? That there are things He doesn't know about and that don't come under His will? So if they're kind of at least partially on the same page as far as the nature and existence of God, then you can bring them a certain ways along the path with you.
Right. Okay, well, that makes sense.
Yeah, but you know, what you run into these days is, well, yeah, I see, but I just don't feel that way.
Right.
Yeah.
I just feel that, I just feel, and you go, okay, well, I can't deal with that.
Right.
You know, I can't address your emotions. I have to use a logical process if we're going to talk about things. So yeah, that's it. It's bring them as far along. And, you know, most of those will be exercises in frustration. You just resign to that. Okay, so what does Scripture say? Well, you can read all those things, you know. These are just little quotes from Scripture about the nature of the soul and God and all this kind of thing. Okay, on one occasion, let's skip over to page 12 there. How right then was Voltaire in saying materialism is the most enormous of all absurdities and the greatest folly that has entered the human mind? How right is our simple catechism, which bids our little children to repeat, I must take most care of my soul, for Christ has said, what doth it profit a man if he gain the whole world and suffer the loss of his own soul? On one occasion, a young man came to visit St. Philip Neri and informed him that he was sitting for an examination. And after the exam, asked the saint, a degree I hope, and after the degree, I want to be a barrister. And then, I suppose I shall have to work hard to make some money to settle down in life. And then, oh, I may end up as a judge. And then, at any rate, I shall have a pension on which to retire. And then I suppose I shall have to die someday. And then, is it any wonder that the young man gave up his worldly career to devote himself to the service of God in St. Philip's own congregation of the Oratory? During life, we are engaged in the task of making our souls ready for eternity. We cannot escape from that task, even for a second. Just as a great masterpiece of painting is made up of a multitude of little strokes, so the state of our soul for all eternity will be the result of our every thought, word, deed, and omission during life. Everyone needs to keep this fact foremost in mind at all times. This is one of the part that we'll have our, right? We are free. The very fact that good is to be rewarded and evil punished implies that men are free to do good and avoid evil. Every man will reap what he sows. He is free during life to identify himself with either good or evil. The choice rests with him. Before acting, he deliberates. In acting, he chooses. But deliberation and choice testify to man's freedom. It is he who determines which group of motives is to prevail, and he knows that he is not merely passively swayed by these motives. He is conscious, too, that he does not let himself drift in the direction of the predominating enticement, that is, enticement to sin. When he has chosen, he knows he could have chosen otherwise. So, just remember, as all the saints, especially the martyrs, have taught us, that no matter what is done to you, no matter what is done to your body, no matter what temptations you are thrown, nobody can force you to sin. It's only in accepting to do something that's wrong that you sin. Geraldine Jones, remember? Flip Wilson, the devil made me do it. Yeah, well, the devil can't really make you do it. The devil can lead you along the primrose path, but in the end, he even cannot make you sin. Your sin, in fact, is a capacity to sin or choose is in the will, which is in the soul, and in the body. So the martyrs knew no matter what you did to their body, the capacity to sin or not sin was in their soul, which they couldn't touch. And they chose not to sin, just as we must choose that same thing. duty, law, obligation, responsibility, punishment, reward, merit. All these and many other words imply moral liberty. The universal consent of mankind, expressed in the laws, literature, and language of all ages and nations, affirms that real obligations do exist. The lunatic, who is not legally responsible for his actions, and I was hoping Obama would be prosecuted someday, is carefully distinguished in the law from the criminal who is responsible for what he does. So you hear about this all the time. Somebody's arrested for thus and such, and their lawyers, what do they try to do? They try to plead temporary or permanent insanity, because even our court system still recognizes the difference between what people do in their right minds and what they don't. What was this? I forget what the trial was a while ago. No, it wasn't O.J. Simpson, it was later than that. There was something more recent I was hearing on the news. And this guy was like a street person, kind of a hobo, bum sort of thing. He was schizo, and he did some kind of a crime. And they kept on reporting, well, he's in a mental institution, and they're basically what they're doing is getting him back in his right mind so he can stand trial. Well, if he was already schizo or something, why did they have to spend tens of hundreds of thousands of dollars on this guy to later prove what we already knew? I mean, if you have to give him lithium so he can stand trial, then it stands to reason that he couldn't reason when he did the crime. And it should be pretty much open and shut. But anyway, I'm sure you all heard about it. You all didn't kind of news whatsoever. The internal feelings of self-approbation after good actions and remorse after evil ones imply profound realization of one's personal responsibility. Okay, how many times do we hear in a mocking manner that, oh, you Catholics, you know, it's all about guilt, right? Or Jews, for that matter. You hear about Jews and guilt as well. And this, they're saying this is a bad thing because, you know, we really, they imply we really need to be free from guilt, right? Guilt-free everything. Guilt-free crimes, guilt-free potato chips, you know, whatever. The idea is that Catholics are all into guilt, and we should not be into guilt and not have any kind of guilt because guilt is bad. Guilt is good. Guilt is a knee-jerk reaction. You know, knee-jerk? You go to your pediatrician and he takes a little rubber hammer and goes boing and your leg goes like that. Okay. Knee-jerk reaction. Guilt is a response to a soul that has sinned. A soul that sins should have guilt. They should feel guilt. When you start getting people away from guilt, then that makes what we call psychopaths or sociopaths. People who commit sins, crimes with no guilt. Because you can kill your conscience. If you're guilty, it means if you feel guilty, it means you still have a conscience. And that's a good thing. When criminals don't, then that's a bad thing. So just a minute more here. Okay. Character traits which are influenced by heredity and environment and the circumstances of the moment obviously count tremendously in a person's conduct, but they do not absolutely control the action of any person's will. It is one thing to be influenced by a motive. It is quite another thing to be inexorably determined by it. That man is personally responsible for his thoughts, words, and deeds is well expressed by Shakespeare when he put these words into the mouth of Iago. "'Tis in ourselves that we are thus or thus. Our bodies are our gardens, to the which our souls are gardeners. So that if we will plant nettles or sow lettuce, set hyssop and weed up thyme, supply it with one gender of herbs or distract it with many, either to have it sterile with idleness or manured with industry, why, the power and corrigible authority of this lies in our wills." Okay, halftime.